Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne, and today I'm trying to take the characters from Monster High and make them actually scary. So as a child, I also really yearned for spooky, scary content. I loved Goosebumps, I loved all kinds of media that I probably wasn't supposed to be watching. I really yearned for Halloween and horror and stuff like that. There was something about it that was just so appealing to me, and so I'm not surprised at all that Monster High has had such a successful run. I have also actually done a video where I refaced some Monster High dolls relatively unsuccessfully. I also accidentally gave those dolls away to Goodwill when I was moving, so I don't have them anymore, but maybe I'll try again in the future because I do find doll refacing so interesting. But today I'm going to be using my character design chops to try to create a properly horrifying version of some of the primary characters out of Monster High. Now, starting off, of course, with Draculaura, I feel like she is definitely like the most emblematic of Monster High. She's kind of the main character, to me at least, and she is a vampire. Now, in the actual canon of the dolls and the show, she is a vegetarian and she faints at the sight of blood. This is a really clever way to take away some of the scariness of her being a vampire. She's the adopted daughter of Dracula, so there's a lot of separation between her and the actual monster that she's based on. But of course, in my version, she is going to be a full-blown vampire who does in fact eat blood, and I even had her eating a heart in my illustration because, well, there's a lot of blood in there, and also because I think the gorier, more consuming type of vampire is always scarier to me. There's something about just sucking blood from the neck that doesn't look as horrifying as, say, consuming an organ, particularly the heart. And the other reason I really wanted to include an anatomically correct heart is because hearts are such a big part of her motif. She often has one on her cheek, as well as various other places on her, her shoes and her clothing. There have been so many versions of Draculaura at this point, and so many different designs for her in her outfits and whatnot, but hearts do appear on her quite often, so I definitely wanted to include something to do with the heart. I really wanted to make her look like a scary little girl. She's actually 1600 years old, but she is realistically more like a 16-year-old girl. I feel like I made her look even a little younger than that, and I'm kind of leaning into that horrifying little girl trope with her. And I just made her eyes super big. I wanted to do a lot of little clever things in her clothes, but definitely not make her as detailed as the fashion doll designs for her, because in an illustration sometimes that can get a little cluttered. I did end up putting some fang motifs on the bottom of her shoes. And one of my biggest struggles with her actually was I think I was going a little bit too hard. I realized that I actually might get in trouble with YouTube if I make it look too gory, especially because this is technically kids media. So I did tone it down a little bit later, but she definitely looks like she's been chomping on that heart. I also tried to keep really true to her color palettes, only desaturating it a little bit. Again, because she is a fashion doll, she is in a lot of different outfits canonically. However, there are some colors that are almost always included when it comes to Draculaura, in particular hot pink, white, and black. I did take some of those pinks and warm them up into more of the red zone, of course, to make it look scarier and more like blood. And I tried to even give her this sort of sickly internal organ pink color on her skirt. I decided to try to stick pretty close to her actual silhouette for this first one before getting a little wilder with some of the other characters that you're going to see later. And in general, this one wasn't too hard. I mean, I think the core of Draculaura is this idea of the vampire, the bloodsucker, and by just making her a little messy with the way that she eats her meal and making her fangs sort of stick out in more jarring directions rather than just your traditional vampire bite, I think that she looks quite terrifying. I also tried to convey in her actual expression this sort of glassy look, like she's looking at you not as another person but as a possible meal. I don't know if that totally conveyed, but that was what I was going for. I also gave her some nice long nails, kind of claw-like, and I gave her some little beads on the end of her puff sleeves that I think look like little blood droplets. Next up we have Clawdeen Wolf. She ended up being my favorite in the refacing video, and I think that she's so adorable. Her sculpt, at least her old sculpt, was absolutely precious. She is a werewolf, so I definitely wanted to really lean into the like more animalistic wolfy qualities, but I didn't want to just make her look like anthro or a furry. So instead of doing like a half transformed version of her, I decided to do more of like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing, where you clearly see her human attributes underneath, but on this other side we have this wolf face. And I almost like this idea that she's like maybe some kind of like serial killer who thinks of herself like a wolf. I don't know why I started going down this direction, but I wanted her to look really high energy and really intimidating, like she'd like rush towards you, you know. I apparently in the TV show, her general characterization is that she is very energetic and very like bold and assured of herself, which is very good for this type of creature. I mean, we're just going with full high energy. I want her to look very wild and feral, like you have no idea, you know, where she might come from, but she might stalk you through the night streets. We don't have enough female serial killers in fiction, I feel like. So I actually like this idea a lot. Again, like I love werewolves in fiction, but I do feel like in visual mediums sometimes they're not as interesting. I think it's just really hard to convey the horror of like a half person half wolf, whereas like in written fiction I feel like it really is a good metaphor for like people who lose their temper for whatever reason, or you know, someone who was a trusted person but then showed that they were not to be trusted. I think that that's a really fascinating metaphor, and it's interesting to see applied to a female character. They don't obviously go too deep into this aspect of it in Monster High, but I do try to think about the core fears that each of the monsters come from, or are like presumed to come from. There are so many interesting psychological reasons why certain monsters become extra terrifying for society at the time that they're popularized. And with werewolves, I feel like there's a lot of like feelings about like addiction and domestic violence and stuff. So I did end up going kind of a different direction for her than I was initially thinking. I felt like I was going to lose too much of her face if I just made like the animal aspect like everything about the design. So yeah, I went for more of this Jekyll and Hyde kind of vision. Maybe she would be like, you know, just a wonderful friend and like someone you're really close and trusting with, and then she like flips over to this other side of herself where she's a killer stalking the streets. I can almost see her even like, they talk a lot about Clawdeen being very protective of her friends. Maybe she's almost like this yandere type who feels that she's just protecting her friends and she's doing what she has to do. She's almost kind of wild in that way. There's a lot you could do with a super horror version of Clawdeen, but I hope you like how she turned out. Next up we have Cleo, and I was so excited to do this one because, like many kids, I had an obsession with ancient Egypt, and specifically an obsession with mummies and mummification. I was a very morbid child, so I was very interested in how a mummy was made and like why, and the whole process. So for those of you who don't know, mummification, before they get into like the salting of the body to remove and like remove all the water, they have to very quickly remove the internal organs. It's one of the things that helps the body not rot while they're doing all the other processes. And certain organs were held in jars because they were considered important and like necessary in the afterlife of the individual who's being mummified. But one of the things that they would just scrape out and did not think was super useful was actually the brain, and they would use like various different metal hooks to pull the brain out through the nose so that they wouldn't damage like the skull or, the face. So it was a very delicate process and very difficult and very tedious. But I definitely wanted to include her holding this hook because I just think it's so morbid and so creepy. Though again, like, you know, this isn't happening to someone who's still alive, so while it is gory, it's not necessarily like torture or anything, but it's definitely, I think, a creepy element of the mummification process to think about now, just because yes, it would be, it's utilizing a part of our anatomy and like a connection in our anatomy that I think we try not to think about. But yeah, she is a mummy, obviously. Her characterization, it seems, according to the wiki, is that she is kind of a queen-like character. I should say that, like, I haven't consumed a lot of Monster High, like the TV show. I did watch a little bit of the Japanese shorts that they made, and I have seen a little bit of the show, but I did want to read up on them and make sure I wasn't doing anything that was like wildly against their characterization officially anyway. So she definitely seems like she was a very noble type. She's not in line to be like the queen, so that does free her up to have some of her own interests, and she is the captain of the fear leading squad, which is so cute. I absolutely love that. Fear leading, that's just adorable. But I definitely wanted to include the fact that like mummies typically are hollowed out. They don't have their internal organs anymore. So I actually like showed that in a way with her stomach being kind of like open and just empty. There's a little jar next to her, so you know they're safe and sound elsewhere. I also had this kind of like petechial hemorrhaging in her eye. Just kind of implies that you know she's an undead spirit or an undead being. It is really interesting that like even when we think about the modern mummy movie that did quite poorly, you know, you see a female character and usually like they try to make her really attractive or whatever, but I do think like after the mummification process, like there's going to be some gnarliness that you can't fully remove. I also decided to put this little mask up on her head that closely resembles her actual like doll face, like the reference, and I did that because in a different type of mummification process, they will actually paint very painstakingly a likeness of the person over their wrappings, and so you can actually look at that. I've actually seen that at the Getty, and it was very impactful to me, very interesting, so I wanted to do a little nod to that. I also decided to put the little gems that you see on her cheek in the reference image. I decided to have them sort of like more stuck into her skin just for a little more body horror. I hope I'm not making these too spooky. Sometimes I'm not sure. I really do love like scary stuff in horror movies. So yeah, let me know if I'm going too far. But here she is. I added in, of course, all her gold strands at the end here. Next up, we have Twyla Boogeyman. Now, this is a character I actually didn't know off the top of my head, but I completely love her vibe. It seems like she's one of the younger characters, and she's related to the Boogeyman. She lives in a manor maze, according to the wiki, which just sounds absolutely fascinating to me. And the main thing I noticed about her is that I feel like her design is a little bit less like evocative of anything in particular, perhaps because a boogeyman is kind of a vague term for anything that could go bump in the night, any kind of little shadow that you see when you're trying to fall asleep in the darkness. So I understand why it doesn't look as obvious as, say, like Cleo or Clawdeen or Draculaura's designs, but I did want to try to really like nail down what a boogeyman is in my mind and make her look more like that. She definitely seems like the least scary of any of the girls by default. Like Clawdeen at least has her fangs and her ears. Cleo clearly looks like she's inspired by a mummy. And Draculaura actually has definitely some like gothy vampiric nods in her design, whereas I feel like Twyla's she's just like a cute pale girl with pastel hair. It looks like she would absolutely have killed it on 2012 Tumblr. She's like a pastel goth queen. But for my super scary version of her, I definitely wanted to give her almost kind of like a salad fingers vibe. I know that's kind of an old reference, but I'm just trying to think about the things that were kind of like vague and creepy back in my childhood, and it was definitely stuff like that. Like you know, feeling like you saw a person but they're like a little too tall, or you know, it's just a shape, something vague like that. Her design really wasn't coming together for me at first. I was quite nervous that it wasn't going to work, but I had confidence that with the darkness effect I was going to do at the very end, that it would really come together, because to me a boogeyman is always somebody that you see in the shadows, just this indistinct threat that is particularly terrifying when you're trying to go to bed. I am so glad to report that I don't have chronic nightmares anymore. Anyone who remembers my nightmares video, I was pretty much resigned for having them for the rest of my life, but I no longer do. But when I did, I definitely remember waking up in the middle of the night after having a nightmare and seeing like shapes and stuff in my room, and it makes it even worse. It makes it even scarier. So definitely very familiar with the concept of a boogeyman. For Twyla, I wanted to show sort of her exposed ribs and utilize a lot of different little like shapes in her silhouette to make her look extra creepy. The silhouette was my main like design feature for her, so it's something I really wanted to think about. The elongated like fingers and body, of course, is also a Slenderman staple. I feel like a lot of boogeymen have this as like their core design. They're like a human, but they're stretched out. Even like the image of like Momo or Jeff the Killer, a lot of the times this is a human base with parts of the anatomy just exaggerated, stretched, or blown out. So that is the core of my idea for her. I tried to stick to her color palette, though I did add so much darkness in the final image that you can't really tell, but I did like color pick pretty directly for everything, and I really do like her color aesthetic. I think if she wasn't a doll, it would be nicer for her to be a little more desaturated. And I mean, it is Monster High, you know, like you don't have to follow the super saturated merchandising rules that you might have to with like a Barbie or a Bratz doll. I think that, you know, you're already appealing to kids who kind of like something a little different. So maybe making more of a monochromatic doll. I know that I'm not sure if it was actually Monster High or one of like the Ever After dolls that were trying to kind of utilize the popularity of Monster High. I remember there was one that had like a stone texture to her skin. That one was so cool, and it was very desaturated like that. So maybe they were doing stuff like that, just not with Twyla in particular. But here she is all done. I feel like her whole design comes together after I add in that shaded lighting effect at the end, and I really hope that you guys like her too. So here are all my super horrifying Monster High girls together. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you would like to see from me next, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much to my wonderful patrons, including Colorful Ambitions, AA Ron, Viet, Raccoon Jam, Grexius, Olia, Brandon Stark, CB, Lucy Amajiki, Liv, Salty Jackrabbit, Ravenscrow, Zocelot, Teal Music, Jabber Dabber Doo, Kadaria, Deadly Nightshade Art, Astrofox Art, The Expressive Poker Face, Tsubaki, Cutie Pie, Kola, JJ Jade, and of course, Liv.